You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast. So the last few episodes we've done have been a little bit different. The podcast started off really related to obesity as it ties in with health and wellness. And we've deviated off into addiction and some mental health issues. And I think those are great, but I'm just going to pull back just a little bit and kind of go back into the health and wellness as related to diet and exercise. Just temporarily, we've got lots of guests lined up. But today is kind of an interesting episode. We just got back from Spain. My family and I went to Barcelona. We spent about a little over a week there, and then we went to Pamplona and we ran with the bulls. We all ran. We had a great time. It's an incredible event. It's so much fun, but it truly is scary. And it really is dangerous, but just a bucket list thing. When we were there was some interesting observations that I made. And so I'm going to talk about them, and then I'm going to talk about the diet. We had a listener who has asked us to kind of go over the various diets. And so I'm going to do a series on the different diets. There's so many diets out there. There's the Mediterranean diet, which is what we're going to talk about today. But there's the Atkins diet and the keto diet, the carnivore diet, and they go on and on. They all have their pros and cons. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Mediterranean diet, just simply because we came back from Spain and literally swam in the Mediterranean Sea. One of the observations I noticed is that everybody's just very lean and seemingly somewhat fit. And there were some overweight and obese people around, but it almost seemed like they were the tourists. And I don't know. In all fairness, we were in probably the touristy sections of Barcelona. And then in Pamplona, I don't know if there was a touristy section per se, but we were definitely where the event was with running with the bulls. It may be skewed observation, but it was there. But when we go back and just look at the data on obesity in Spain, in 1987, about 7.3% of people in Spain were obese. And by 2020, that number had doubled to 15.7. Compare that to the U.S. data. In 1990, right around 20% of Americans were overweight or obese. A little over 21% of women were obese, and almost 17% of men were obese. By 2022, 44% of women were obese, and almost 42% of men were obese. So when you look at the statistics, even though the years don't line up perfectly, there is a significant disparity between the overweight and obesity rates between the two countries. What determines that is multifactorial, like we've talked before. So clearly one of the contributing factors to that would be the diet. And so when we were walking around looking, there's definitely some fast food restaurants, right? McDonald's does have a presence there. Burger King has a really big presence there. We saw some Taco Bells, but there's not a lot of them. And the other thing that is really striking is just everything's smaller. Like waistlines are smaller and butts are smaller, but cars are smaller, portions are smaller. A cup of coffee in the morning. I'm used to going through Starbucks and you get a tall or a grande or a venti, In Spain, the only thing you could get, even at Starbucks, was an Americano. And the cup that it would come in would be like the size of the tall, which for non-Starbucks people is a small. But then the Americano that you got in Spain was about 3/4 full, right? So just the quantities, the portions are smaller. And they eat these things called tapas, which are various foods that come in small, almost like appetizer portions. And as I understand it, they come on smaller plates. And the name originates from where you could put the plate on top of your glass of wine to keep the flies out of it. So you would go into these restaurants and you might, you'd order something to drink and then they'd bring you all these tapas and you'd order the tapas as well, right? And there are various things, a lot of Iberian ham, olives, sardines, salmon, peppers, but you just eat a little bit and, drink some red wine or some white wine or what they call cava, which is like champagne, but technically to be champagne, it needs to come from Champagne, France. And so it's a sparkling white wine. But the portions are just smaller. And even if you got a proper meal, like a proper entree, the plates were smaller, the portions were smaller. And that clearly has got to contribute as well. But also, they eat sort of a typical Mediterranean diet. So the question then comes up is exactly what is the Mediterranean diet? And it's interesting. There's no really clear cut criteria for what is and what isn't the Mediterranean diet. With a lot of the other diets that I listed and the other diets that we'll go over in time, there are very clear borders of what is in and what is out, what you can eat and what you can't eat. And with the Mediterranean diet, it's much more fluid, but it's really based on sort of a typical diet of food that is grown in the region. The Mediterranean diet originates from countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea, which include Greece and Italy, Spain, and France. But the Mediterranean diet, in and of itself, like I said, doesn't have any clear absolutes as to what's in and what's out. But what they do eat are a lot of fruits and a lot of vegetables. There's a lot of whole grains, and nuts and seeds and legumes are a big part. When we went to one of the markets, they had these different areas and they would just have all these legumes out and seeds and nuts and all this fresh fruit. Extra virgin olive oil is a big component of the Mediterranean diet. And it's consistent with, what Ansel Keys was saying was heart healthy. So when I talk about these different diets, I'm not necessarily endorsing everything that they're saying. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. Clearly, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, all these things are healthy. Extra virgin olive oil is a healthy fat. I think there's a lot of debate whether or not this issue of fat versus sugar, where's the real problem. And I definitely kind of tend to lean on the fact that sugar and carbohydrates create more issues with fat than fats like dietary fats do. But that's kind of a different topic. One thing that they eat a lot less of are processed foods and then sugars, added sugars. And then wine, I really thought in the Mediterranean diet that red wine or white wine was a big component of it. But as I did my research on this, it is a component, but to the level of about 3 to 5 ounces per day is the recommendation. Now, again, there's no clear-cut criteria, but one thing that I did run across on multiple studies was that if you don't drink alcohol, they don't encourage you to start. Not too long ago, there was a lot of thought that a small amount of red wine on a daily basis was heart healthy. And now the literature really points out to a lot of deleterious effects from alcohol. And so it's not encouraged probably in any diet, but definitely not part of the Mediterranean diet per se. Is it a weight loss diet? Well, any diet can be a weight loss diet, right? You just have to minimize the calories. When you're trying to lose weight, you just reduce your calories. You want the calories that you burn to exceed the calories that you take in. And if you do that over time, it's a weight loss. So in fact, the Mediterranean diet could be a diet for weight loss. But I think more importantly, when you think of any diet, it should be a lifestyle that you're embracing. And I think that's one of the things that the Mediterranean diet really offers over some of these others is that it's a relatively easy and flavorful complement of foods that is offered, but it's not just terribly restrictive. Again, it's difficult to really, pin down the Mediterranean diet. I'm sure the Mediterranean diet, as the population in Spain would see it, would be different than Greece or France, just because they're all a little bit different. But they definitely all tend to be relatively plant-based, fairly low in animal products and meat, saturated fats in that form, and big on fish and seafood. Let's talk about some of the dietary components that make up the typical Mediterranean diet. So in terms of vegetables, things like tomatoes, broccoli, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cauliflower, carrots, Brussels sprouts, those are all sort of typical vegetables that you'd see in the Mediterranean diet. In terms of fruits, you think about grapes, dates, figs, but more common fruits to America would be things like strawberries, peaches, pears, oranges. Nuts and seeds are extremely common. It seemed like I saw a lot of pistachios when I was over there. Pistachio croissants, a lot of the desserts, which they're not big on sweets, but a lot of desserts had like pistachio dust on them. So pistachios, almonds, walnuts, cashews, sunflower seeds, and then nut butters, almond butter, peanut butter, probably pistachio butter. Like I said, at the market, when we went to the market, they just had these big vats. One of the vendors would just have these big vats and they'd have beans and lentils, peanuts, chickpeas. Of course, hummus is chickpeas, and that's just a very common thing associated with the Mediterranean diet. At least that's what here in the United States we associate it. In terms of breads or cereals, not like boxed cereals, but cereals in a broader term, oftentimes there include whole grains such as, oats, rye, buckwheat, whole wheat grains, whole wheat breads. In terms of fats, a lot of their fats come in the form of like extra virgin olive oil, olives, avocados, a lot of seafood in the Mediterranean diet: salmon, sardines, trout, shrimp, mussels, mackerel, clams, crab. Dairy products include Greek yogurt, different kinds of yogurt, milk, cheeses. Those are just some various dietary components that are included in the Mediterranean diet. In terms of foods that aren't really typically included is added sugars. Desserts are seemingly less common there. Gelato shops were present, not a lot of ice cream. There were a fair amount of baked goods, like croissants and different danishes. But again, we were in the areas that were sort of typically touristy, so I don't know if it's really representative of Spain as a whole or even the Mediterranean diet. But as a general rule, added sugar is minimized in the Mediterranean diet, as are things like white bread or kind of typical non-whole wheat pastas, tortillas. Processed meats are limited, although they have this product called Iberian ham. And you'll see the hog's leg just hanging in the restaurant. It's extremely salty, but that's how it's preserved. And so, it's reported that they could sit out for as long as, maybe 2 months without being refrigerated. It's so preserved with salt, but natural preservatives in the form of salt. And then, of course, really highly processed foods like the McDonald's and boxed cereals, things like that, are not really part of the typical Mediterranean diet per se. Wine is somewhat on the fence whether it's in or out. And I'm sure, each citizen of these Mediterranean countries has their own opinion on that. And there's no definitive source. Water is a big component. And then, of course, coffee. But most of the coffees, like I said, like drip coffee, I couldn't find a drip coffee. If you wanted just a typical black coffee, it was an Americano. Otherwise, it was a lot of those sort of fancier drinks, which probably do contain a fair amount of sugar. Beer was a fairly common finding over there, although I don't think it's typically really part of the Mediterranean diet. That generally sums up what is sort of in and out. And like I said, it's very loosely defined, and I think each of the Mediterranean countries has their own variation. And in fact, when I was doing my research on this, somebody had posted on Reddit kind of their opinion, and it was somebody that grew up in one of the Mediterranean countries. And they were saying that even as Westerners, if we try to mimic it, we're really not doing a good job, because the meats that we have here are different than the meats that they have there. They're not raised eating the same sort of grasses and in the same sort of environment. And so there's always those nuances that you just can't account for. As they've gone back and looked at different ways to determine if this is a healthy diet, they've done a lot of research on it. There's a famous study that came out of Spain called the PREDIMED Trial, PREDIMED. And most of these trials have names like that are extracted from the various words used to put them together. And so this one was the Prevención con Dieta Mediterránea. I'm sure I did not say that appropriately. But it looked at the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease with a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil or nuts. I don't want to go into all of the details. So the PREDIMED study was really designed to assess the long-term effects of a Mediterranean diet on the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease in individuals at increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And the inclusion criteria was that they had to be free of cardiovascular disease at the time of enrollment, but they had to have increased risk factors, including either type 2 diabetes or 3 of the following risk factors. They were current smokers, they had hypertension, they had elevated LDL, they had depressed HDL, they were overweight or obese, and they had a family history of premature cardiovascular disease. So if you had 3 of those 6, or you were a type 2 diabetic, and you didn't have heart disease, you could be enrolled into this study. In the end, I can tell you that what they found was that they had 3 arms, and they looked at it in different ways. And essentially, when these patients were enrolled, if they were ultimately put on a Mediterranean diet, there was improvement of these risk factors. And so it did serve a good role as a primary prevention method. And then they also did various additional studies, which is not uncommon. But one of them was they looked at a 14-item Mediterranean diet assessment tool associated with obesity indexes among high-risk subjects in the PREDIMED trial. That's a lot to take over, but let me just kind of summarize that for you. So there was about almost 7,500 patients and they were enrolled. And so they came up with a 14-question assessment tool, and they correlated it with a very extensive food frequency questionnaire. And oftentimes these food frequency questionnaires have over 100 items on them, and they require people to recall over 24 hours and what time they consumed and how much they ate. The food frequency questionnaires, although they're good, they can be quite burdensome. And when you increase the burden, then it really decreases the accuracy, or at least there's the potential to have significant decreased accuracy in data. So they came up with this 14-question questionnaire, and they were able to correlate it with the food frequency questionnaire and basically determine that these 14 questions were equally as good at determining data that they were looking for in the patients. So after they correlated these 14 questions to the food frequency questionnaire and realized that they could use these 14 questions with the same validity, they proceeded on. So let me go over the 14 questions and the criteria to earn 1 point. So each of the 14 questions is worth 1 point. I'm going to tell you the question and then I'll tell you how you get 1 point for that. So the first one is, do you use olive oil as the main culinary fat? If the answer is yes, you get 1 point. Second question, how much olive oil do you consume on a given day? So if it's greater than 4 tablespoons, that's worth 1 point. The third question, how many vegetable servings do you consume per day? If it's greater than 2 or greater than 1 portion raw or as a salad, you get 1 point. Fourth question, how many fruit units do you consume per day, including natural fruit juices without sugar added? If it's greater than 3 servings or 3 fruit units, you get 1 point. Fifth question, how many servings of red meat, hamburger, or meat products you consume in a day? If the answer is less than 1 serving, then that's worth 1 point. The sixth question, how many servings of butter, margarine, or cream do you consume per day? If it's less than 1, that's worth 1 point. Seventh question, how many sweets or carbonated beverages do you drink per day? Again, less than 1, 1 point. Next question, how much wine do you drink per week? If it's greater than 7 glasses, then it's worth 1 point. Ninth question, how many servings of legumes do you consume per week? If it's greater than 3 per week, you get 1 point. 10th question, how many servings of fish or shellfish do you consume per week? And if it's greater than 3 servings, that's worth 1 point. Number 11, how many times per week do you consume commercial sweets or pastries, such as cakes, cookies, biscuits, or custards? Now, this is different than if they're homemade. This is commercially prepared. So if it's less than 3, then you get 1 point. 12th question, how many servings of nuts do you consume per week? If it's greater than 3, that's worth 1 point. 13th question, do you preferentially consume chicken, turkey, or rabbit meat instead of veal, pork, hamburger, or sausage? If the answer is yes, that's worth 1 point. And the last question is, how many times per week do you consume vegetables, pasta, rice, or other dishes seasoned with sofrito? And if the answer is greater than 2, then that's worth 1 point. So those are the 14 questions. And even though when I read them off, they sound a little cumbersome, but if you can imagine being able to sit down with a patient and just go over these 14 questions, and these are easy questions for these patients to answer because this is just what they eat. It would be no different than us answering questions about our diet. But instead of having over 100 questions to ask and quantities and everything else, they were able to really boil it down to 14 questions. And from that, they were just able to extract so much data. I mean, it's incredible the amount of data they got. But then they're able to take that point system, they asked the questions, they got the answers, they assigned a point or they didn't assign a point. From that, what they could do is they could look at the patients and say, okay, those that adhered to the Mediterranean diet on a scale of 0 to 14-point score, this is how they fall out. For example, in women, if your adherence to the Mediterranean diet, 14-question questionnaire, if you had less than 5, your body mass index was likely to be higher than if your score was greater than 10. And really, when you look at it, the criteria is less than 5 or 6 to 7 or 8, 9, or greater than 10. And when you look at the BMIs, they all go down. As there's more adherence to the Mediterranean diet, the BMI goes down. The more adherent you are to the Mediterranean diet, the lower your body mass index tends to be based on this study. It's also true of waist circumference, right? Which is another measure that we talked about in a previous podcast to measure obesity, and not just obesity, not just general obesity, but abdominal obesity, which we know oftentimes is higher in visceral fat and has a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. It's the same thing. The more points you got on that 14-point questionnaire, which was reflective of a better adherence to a Mediterranean diet, the lower your waist circumference was. They also looked at it with the waist to height ratio with the same findings. The more adherent you were to a Mediterranean diet, the more appropriately proportioned your waist to height ratio was. And that is across both men and women. Then they looked at the prevalence of obesity and looked at multivariable adjusted odds ratio, or what the likelihood of you having obesity, either abdominal obesity or general obesity, is associated with adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And again, the scale here was a little bit different. If you had less than 7 points, that was one category. 8 to 9 was a second category, and greater than 10 was the third category. If you had less than 7, you were much more likely to have abdominal obesity than if your questionnaire resulted in a 10-point score or greater. And that was true for both men and for women. And it just tracks. It tracks perfectly across. The lower adherence you had to the Mediterranean diet, the more likely you were to have abdominal obesity or general obesity. And the more adherent you were to the Mediterranean diet, the less likely you were. So then they went in and looked at adherence on each of these different criteria. And they just looked at the odds ratio, right? So the odds ratio just tells you if the number's greater than 1, you're more likely to have whatever you're looking at, right? So a higher BMI is what they looked at on this one. And so they just kind of picked out some of the different criteria and looked. So they looked at specific questions within the 14-point score of adherence. For example, the question about eating red meat. So if you didn't get the point for that, that meant that you didn't adhere to the Mediterranean diet in that capacity. Then your odds ratio of having a higher BMI was present. When they look at that, they see that the question about red meats definitely led to a higher BMI. The question about sugary drinks, soda, and baked goods, all of those specifically showed a greater odds ratio, a more likely incidence of having a high BMI if you answered negatively on the adherence to the Mediterranean diet. But then conversely, if you answered positively that you were compliant with wine, olive oil, vegetables, and nuts, those patients all tended to have lower BMIs. So again, it's just intuitive of what you would think. If you're adherent to the Mediterranean diet as reflected in this 14-point score, then you would have a lower BMI typically. And if you weren't adherent, you'd have a higher BMI. But this just goes in and kind of drills down on the individual questions. And specifically, that's how that shook out in terms of BMI. They looked at the same questions with the waist to height ratio and found the same thing. Red meats, soda drinks, and commercial baked goods. If you consume those, meaning you weren't compliant with the Mediterranean diet as defined by this PREDIMED diet, then you tended to have a higher odds ratio. You had a higher likelihood of having a higher waist to height ratio. But if you were compliant with the Mediterranean diet as defined by the PREDIMED study, in terms of wine, vegetables, olive oil, and nuts, then you were more likely to have a lower waist to height ratio. This study was really interesting. Not only did it show the cardiovascular benefits of the Mediterranean diet, but then this sort of sub-study really went in and looked at the association between general obesity and abdominal obesity. And they go as far as to say that this is the first time that an inverse association between the adherence to the Mediterranean diet and the waist to height ratio has been reported in adult population using an easily administratable brief tool to assess the overall quality of diet and its conformity to the traditional Mediterranean dietary pattern. And then they also report that prior findings on the relationship between the Mediterranean diet and waist circumference based on previous full-length dietary assessment tools are consistent with the findings of this study as well. From a statistical point, what was really most interesting was that this 14-point questionnaire was able to really drill down on the information and give the information needed in a less time-demanding, less expensive, and sort of less intrusive and time-consuming fashion. Where do we go from here? Well, I think the best thing to do is just to recognize that the Mediterranean diet is a real diet and it can be used as a weight loss diet, but it sounds like it's just a good, solid, healthy diet, right? It shows benefits in cardiovascular disease. It shows compliance with it, decreases your risk of obesity and particularly abdominal obesity, which is very important because that also in turn increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. The other thing about the Mediterranean diet is it's pretty broad. Basically, it's eating whole foods, things that are close to nature, that are sort of naturally occurring. There's so many foods when you go to the grocery store that when you look at the foods, there's like nothing in nature. They don't resemble anything out in nature, right? When you're eating fish and legumes and seafood and whole grains, right? Those are all present in nature. But when you're eating processed foods and boxed cereals and Pop-Tarts and things like that, there's nothing like that. There's nothing in nature that resembles those things. And there's so much of our food supply is just synthetic. And so the Mediterranean diet really just seems like a whole food diet that's really specifically related to the foods that are grown in that region. Although we may not be able to reproduce the exact nature of that, we can definitely reproduce the spirit of that here in the United States and across the world where you're listening to this podcast. I think it's an excellent diet. And like I said, not only do we have the statistics when we look at the lower rates of obesity, even though they are increasing significantly. And then one last thing I'd say about the Mediterranean diet that I think is important is it's not just the diet, right? It's also the lifestyle. These people tend to cook together, they eat together, they tend to eat late at night, which is kind of interesting because it could be a risk factor associated with overweight and obesity, but we don't tend to see that there. And then there tends to be a big family unit in Spain, is my understanding. And I'm not claiming to be any expert on Spanish culture, but it does seem like the family unit and eating together and eating with friends is a big part of that culture. And so remember, from the blue zones, we know that the social aspect of health and wellness is very real. And oftentimes that's associated with eating. That's basically, in summary, what I learned about the Mediterranean diet over these last couple of weeks. I had an incredible time in Spain. I thought it was really fascinating to watch. It was a great vacation, but it was really neat to just see the different diet and the different lifestyle. And really what was reflected in what we saw in the people that were there, who, by the way, were just all extremely friendly and cordial. Hopefully this shines some light on the Mediterranean diet. And, if it's something that you're inclined to, I would encourage you to do a little more research. Feel free to reach out to us at thebmipodcast.com or on any of the social media, and I'll do my best to answer it. The nice thing about dietary changes is if you look at those 14 questions, which we will post on the website, but if you look at those 14 questions and you come across one where the answer is no, where you don't get the point, that is a good place to start the diet, right? There's no urgency to totally alter your diet, right? In fact, I think the slower you ease into a diet, the more likely you are to stick with that diet. So if you went through and did the 14-point questionnaire and there were 2 or 3 that you did not get the point, or if there were 7 or 8 or however many there were, each one of those serves as a potential spot where you can make alterations to your diet that then will sort of lead you toward that adherence to the diet, which ultimately is shown to have improvement in cardiovascular disease as well as obesity and overweight. And of course, with any diet, calories in and calories out do matter. So these are good calories that the Mediterranean diet is recommending, but it doesn't mean that you can have 4,000 calories of them per day and have intentions of losing weight. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI podcast. See you then. The BMI podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms.